All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to me and a pleasure for being here again at CyberThreat in 2025, especially at such an outstanding location here. So, I'd like to borrow your attention a little bit for the upcoming 25 minutes and take you with me on a topic that's super fascinating for myself, and it's all about actually evasion techniques that we see in malware families, and what we can learn from that and how we can use those techniques to basically improve our detection on samples that are actually employ evasion techniques. First of all, I guess we all know that evasion techniques itself, it's nothing new at all. They have been out there for many, many years. There's a lot of great resources out there. It's blog posts, it's conference presentations. So the first question is actually, why do I still stand up here on the stage and trying to talk about them? I mean, it's nothing new, right? Well, if we just Google a little bit and look a bit through blog posts and research results of malware family research, there is a lot of headlines and titles that mention evasion. It's either what do we have here? We have here a highly evasive shellcode loader. It's extremely evasive malware. So this is actually out there everywhere. Of course, we know that titles in blog posts usually tend to sound a little bit more dramatic to encourage people in reading them. But at the same time, it's a question for myself as well. And is it really that dangerous? Is it really that highly evasive that we actually need to be scared of? Or is it something that we can already deal with in some sort of, basically? So that's one of the main ideas why I really like that topic. And the other one is that, I mean, considering evasion techniques in most cases is like a human brain versus a human brain challenge. There's someone sitting behind the computer trying to find new techniques to avoid our security tools, to get around them. And at the same time, we as defenders have to basically step up to the challenge, try to understand what is happening there, and try to find another smart idea to actually still detect them properly. But first of all, before we go into the topic, and you will actually realize that this is really just a small portion of evasion techniques, because otherwise 25 minutes will definitely not be enough. We can talk for hours here. So we'll just show some, at least for us, most relevant points. But before that, let's quickly do a brief sanity check here on what evasion techniques are. And I guess we all know these are just methods that are mainly being used by cyber criminals in order to get around our defenses. There's many different techniques out there, and there's also two buckets that I'd like to separate this. So we have on one side the static evasion that usually focuses or aims to avoid the static detection. So that doesn't mean without executing the code, they just really want to try to hide the code itself. We have heard in the talk before that there is also this obfuscation that I have seen in code. That's usually actually the static side, trying to get around signature-based detections. And the other side is the dynamic evasion, which instead of trying to hide the code, they're actually trying to hide the behavior that a sample could cause during the execution. And that's also the part that I'd like to focus today. That's, at least for us as a sandbox provider, sandbox vendor, usually quite relevant. Before we're going to start with that, let's quickly, briefly talk about the history of sandbox evasion, so where we came from and where we are actually currently. This graph tries to show some of the techniques, as mentioned, it's just a portion of that, which we have seen throughout the past years. Well, actually many years, nearly maybe 20 years. And one of the most common evasion technique we have seen there is probably this sort of timing-based or delay-based evasion. So essentially, if you go back many years, there was malware families, usually called sleep maybe, or different APIs that actually do the same thing, trying to wait for 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes and do nothing just to avoid showing behavior in the first couple of minutes. But usually back then was fair enough to evade analysis tools. Then there have been plenty more, starting from various different artifacts, file artifacts, registry keys. There's hardware-based checks. I guess you can imagine that when it comes to malware analysis, you usually do this in some virtualized environments, maybe at scale. So you probably do not assign 8 gigabytes of memory to your VMs or to many VMs and 4 CPU cores or more. So hardware also was often super easy artifact that can be used by malware families to figure out whether they're being running in a virtualized environment or maybe in a sandbox. Then we have, of course, BIOS, still hardware-related, screen-related checks, the user-related checks, and of course, one of the most favorite ones is also the mouse movements. So just trying to understand that the system that they are executed on is a real used system. If we look into how this looks like nowadays, you probably may wonder at the first look here at the slide, well, why is there actually less on it? So this should not actually tell you that there is less evasion technique nowadays. That's actually not true. But this is mostly the points where we see major improvements or major trends in the past months or years. So we still have same topics here as well. There is sleep-based evasion, but just there are different technologies and different methods out there that are actually being used to achieve that. We still have checks on hardware, like how many RAM, how many gigabytes of memory is this system basically assigned to, but it's also just different techniques that are being used to get to the same results. And those techniques are getting a little bit more, let's say, technically sophisticated. Yeah? What's actually quite new, though, is the use of GPUs. So there's also already malware families out there, not for so many months, I think, a couple of weeks, months, that actually only execute properly on GPUs. Yeah? GPUs are getting more relevant. We all know we're getting into the age of AI, so usually systems are getting shipped with GPUs as well, so they're also being used. Then we have, again, checking a graphic card, which is a little bit related, vendors, device vendors. That's also, of course, one point. And the human-like mouse movement is still a big topic. I do remember, early years when I was joining the VMware, we basically had an automated movement of the mouse implemented during the analysis of malware, and I remember that there was a mouse cursor always just jumping around randomly on the screen. I would be surprised if any one of you is actually able to move the mouse cursor from the lower right corner to the left upper corner without actually drawing a line up there. While this was sufficient back then, this actually changed because nowadays malware tries to really calculate the paths on how the mouse is moving in order to try to determine, is this a real user behavior or is this something automated, basically. But anyways, let's take a look into the trends now, finally, that we do see. And the first point here is that we do actually see an increase of, let's say, new evasion techniques, or at least improvements to existing evasion techniques again. So if we go back in time, I believe it was in 2022, roughly, Microsoft decided to block the execution of macros in Office documents if they're getting downloaded from an untrusted source. That had a huge impact into this whole ecosystem of delivery chains, because instead of just heavily relying on Office documents and macros, which was, maybe the number one back then, threat actors and cyber criminals started to explore with various different file types, making our lives very, very difficult and challenging in a busy time. I guess you all remember there was this big wave of OneNote documents that had embedded scripts, then we had ISO files, image files, and various different other types. As far as we can tell, this trend seems to go down, or actually even already stopped. There is rarely new file types being involved in delivery chains. Instead, we do see more investment again in, trying to, as mentioned before, improving existing evasion techniques or even find new ones. We have copy and paste, which I think is actually quite funny. With copy and paste, I do mean that there is more and more somehow this lazy mode getting enabled by cyber criminals. So they just go, for example, to GitHub and try to look for, some existing tools, like you probably know Parfish or Acacia, these sandbox stress testing tools. They just copy code out of there and put it into their own development and say, hey, look at this, we do have evasive malware, sort of. Which isn't fully true, because usually all modern systems should be capable of dealing with this sort of basic checks that have been out there for many, many years. Although this is still there, and we still, of course, need to deal with them if we do manual analysis. Just one spoiler alert here. Every single evasion technique that they implement, if it's simple and stupid or not, is actually a noise that we can later on use for detection opportunities. And with the age of LLMs, I think this is another point where copy and paste is getting more relevant, because they just try to convince the LLM, giving them some sort of code that maybe is going to check whether this is running on a virtualized environment or not, and they still do copy and paste that stuff in there and hope that it compiles properly. We do have low-level system internals that are getting more and more used, like low-level system structures that reveal relevant data information that you can use to, well, do these usual checks if it's an analysis environment virtualized or not. And I also believe that this is a little bit connected to LLMs because it's, well, I think it makes it more easier and more approachable for, let's assume, script kiddies, for example, to basically figure out more ideas and more ways on how I can do that. But of course, at the same time, it can also be used by more sophisticated actors and that maybe have already way more knowledge, just speeding up that whole process. The check for peripheral devices, as mentioned before, is also something we do see quite more nowadays, especially like display adapters and things like this. And of course, one of my favorite topics is abusing red teaming projects that are getting published. So we all know, and I'm a huge fan of that, that research projects are getting published on GitHub. But of course, we just need to keep that in mind, that whenever we maybe find new ways on how to evade specific stuff, and we're going to use this for red teaming purposes, and we publish that, threat actors usually have the same, or in most cases, same resources than we do. They can use Google, they can use GitHub, so they just can go there and copy-paste stuff out there and also try to build more evasive samples with that. So let's step into some actual examples here, and we'll go with the environment-based evasion first. So here we see 4 major topics that are super relevant, I think. First one is, again, I've mentioned this already before, the check on memory, trying to figure out whether this is maybe a low number of memory and can be basically used to indicate it's a virtual machine. But instead of just using some existing stuff for high-level APIs, there is a trend that low-level NT and native APIs are getting used together with some low-level structures to basically calculate those values. Counting or looking up the number of CPU cores is a similar approach here. Instead of just using high-level APIs, they actually go a step further and go down even sometimes into the kernel, basically, and try to leverage some low-level kernel structures that actually reveal these values. So it's a little bit more nasty and a little bit more hidden versus just using APIs. Well, the vendor of display adapters and graphic cards is something that's quite common nowadays and getting more and more used, especially I think if you see this in terms of analysis environments like sandboxes. You usually don't have a physical display attached to your virtual machines, and you don't really have a graphic card attached to it. That just makes it a little bit more tricky and difficult to get around these checks. And counting the number of running processes is also something new that we have seen, although I think that's quite simple from an idea point of view and also from an implementation point of view. Usually sandboxes try to be as noise-free as possible. That also means they try to run as less additional and overhead systems or services on that virtual machines, because everything that's running there could in theory generate noise. So considering and comparing this with a real used system, you basically do not have that many processes running. There's likely no browser opened, no email client, no whatever Teams, Slack that you use, maybe PowerPoint or Office, whatever. So that's just less processes running per default on these systems. One actual example that we have seen recently in Hijack Loader, they have implemented a check to calculate or to get the number of the RAM that is basically used by the system this sample is executed on. So they make use of NT query system information, completely legitimate native API call. You will see actually this is being used a lot. But this time they are going to query the basic system information structure. This structure contains multiple relevant members, but for us here 2 main relevant members. One of them is the page count, and one of them is the physical page size. So if we're going back to, well, maybe university times, computer science, we have learned at some point that the memory of a computer is built out of physical pages, and each page has a specific size. If you just apply some simple math here and you multiply those values together, you can actually just calculate the number of bytes that this system has as memory. This has been used in Hijack Loader with a simple check. If it's, for example, bigger than 8 gigabytes, then the sample is going to continue. If it's less than 8 gigabytes, it's just going to terminate. The interesting part of the check here is, first of all, the usage of this lower level structure that we haven't seen before, to be honest. And at the same time, the value checking, for example, against 8 gigabyte is also something quite new. While a couple of years ago, we mostly have seen they checked against like, I think like 2 gigabytes, sometimes 4 gigabytes. Nowadays, it's really difficult getting a device actually that has 2 or 4 gigabytes of memory. That's already outdated. You probably won't get any of them anymore. Similar check. Here, instead of focusing on the memory, this is about the running processes on a system. So that's a check we have seen in Latrodectus. They are basically going to request or actually query the version of the operating system. And then they are going ahead and calculating or also querying and reading and counting up the number of running processes on that system. If, in this case, for example, the process runs roughly 75, or the system runs 75 processes, then it's going to continue if it's a Windows 10 or 11 system. And if it's an older system, it only needs 50 processes to run. And as mentioned, that's related to that fact that I've already told you before, that, well, modern systems, they do have more background processes running. Considering Windows 10 or Windows 11, there's way more services, there's way more processes running versus taking a Windows 7. And also due to the fact that sandboxes, as mentioned before, try to run as less additional overhead stuff as possible, this is a fairly easy check that could in theory work quite well. Just trying to compare these values. Then we have timing-based evasion. So timing-based evasion, also something quite interesting, and there are 3 different, well, let's say approaches and how you, well, interesting approaches because we have recently seen changes there, and how you can try to delay the time until, for example, a sandbox is going to terminate and say, hey, this sample is clean, it didn't anything malicious in the time we have observed it. So we have the usage of large useless loops. Could be any chunk code that's just doing some calculation, basically. We have long-running algorithms, and depending on the usage and the output of that algorithm, that can still be considered as a long, useless running loop, or actually some valid output, basically, that is needed at a later point. And of course, also the usage of uncommon APIs. One example of uncommon APIs was like when we looked into Picabot, I believe in 2023, 2024, we have seen that they made use of the beep API to actually cause a sleep. The beep API was simply just trying to make a beeping sound on your computer, and it's actually a synchronous API call, which means it just waited as long as the sound was being played, and once it was done, it actually continued the execution. That's the sort of uncommon APIs because it's not really used anymore nowadays. One example for long-running algorithms. I don't know if anyone of you knows this guy. At least I didn't know him either. It turns out that this is Pietro Mengoli, and he's quite an old Italian mathematician. And he came up with a problem which is called the Basel's problem many, many years ago, which at a later point I think was resolved by Euler. The point here is that this algorithm that they came up with can be used to calculate the approximate value of pi. So in a recent sample that we've looked into, we actually have seen exactly this implementation just in a little bit more obfuscated way. So they implemented this algorithm and tried to calculate the value of pi in this massive long loop, which if you run this on a real physical hardware is roughly taking like 5 minutes until it actually finishes the execution of that. Keeping one thread for 5 minutes busy is nothing really that you need to worry about. If you run this in a virtualized environment, it already takes you like 10 to 15 minutes. And if you add on top of that maybe some monitoring or some debugging, you can imagine that this is actually going exponentially basically upwards, and you probably will never reach a point where this execution is being done. So that's sort of these long-running algorithms, or depending on how you use it, this useless large loops basically. Funny side effect here, I'm quite sure that Pietro Mengoli, like 300 or 400 years ago, never considered at all that his problem and algorithm were at a later point being used to evade sandboxes or, well, security tools, basically. Then we have another bucket or another topic, which is monitoring evasion, and I believe this is actually quite new. With monitoring evasion, I mean, instead of the other checks that usually try, for example, either to say, well, let's check if we're running in a virtualized environment or inside of a sandbox, and then going to terminate. The monitoring evasion focuses on the goal, hey, I don't really care at all if I'm getting analyzed or not. I just want to try to execute in a stealthy way so that I do not cause any alerts, basically. And that's sort of something new that we have seen over the past 2 years that are getting more and more relevant. We have 4 relevant points here. One of them is the usage of direct system calls. I think that was pretty much the entry point into the topic. Then we have the usage of indirect system calls, or even the usage of random indirect system calls. We have a technique called call stack spoofing. And we do have exception handling, or at least the usage of vectored exception handling to basically confuse the execution flow. And in the worst case, you do see a combination of them. So I think we have seen in hijack loader, vectored exception handling in combination with call stack spoofing in combination with random indirect system calls. So they just try to chain those things all together as well. So when we and my team were basically looking into these topics, we actually also came up with the question, well, I mean, there is a lot of knowledge actually needed to come up with these sort of ideas. So we basically were surprised at this point that someone actually came up with them, right? At a later point, it turned out that the majority of these implementations are actually available on GitHub, and they just have been, in most cases, copy-pasted into their own development, with maybe a small couple of adjustments being made. So here we have SysWhispers Framework 2, SysWhispers Framework 3. We do have the Health Vector Gate and stuff like that, right? So this is basically known research that is out there that was abused in sort of this development of hijack loader, for example, and Pikabot partially, that nobody will actually had on their minds. And that actually caused some issues because some sandboxes, some EDR solutions were actually, well, vulnerable against it and, well, let this sample execute without actually raising major alerts. Something important just to remember here. Another super relevant point is when we talk about evasion techniques, I do get the impression that only a small portion of people are also considering that there might be something like evasion techniques are happening on the side of phishing. Yeah? I think majority of people just correlate evasion techniques with file-based malware. While this might have been true after, well, maybe for starting with like 2-3 years ago, this changed actually recently. Phishing is one of the most common vectors to, well, let's say, steal credentials and get a foothold into a company's network. And so also phishing evolved over time, and the phishing actors behind it try to sort of build evasive phishing attacks, basically. Here are some simple examples on what we have seen there so far. It's like the realistic behavior that is being caused by, for example, a human that's being checked, or maybe some input is needed for a certain web page. The detection of VPNs. I think in most cases, whoever is providing security products that analyze actually stuff dynamically, you do not really want to reveal your private or your own IPs from a company's network, for example. So instead, you might go and use a VPN. The problem with VPNs, although, is that those are most likely well-known IP ranges. They are most likely, anyways, maybe well-known IP addresses. They cause reputation usage problems, basically, because they are mostly shared. So it's quite easy for phishing pages to just check where's the request coming from. And if it's a VPN IP, you basically get just redirected to a completely legitimate page, like Wikipedia or whatever we have seen in the past. It's always, to be honest, very disappointing if you, for example, open a phishing link because you know it's an obvious one, and then you, out of nowhere, get presented with Wikipedia pages. Captures is another very big topic. We all know captures have been introduced and built with the goal to avoid, well, bot-like behavior. And speaking honestly, automated URL analysis tools or sandboxes are actually bots that are going to analyze these URLs. So another challenge we basically have to deal with. And then, of course, we have the abusage of open redirect vulnerabilities, where just some URLs are being used that do show a little bit more trust. Well, that's basically nowadays the world of phishing that we have to deal with, and I actually brought one example with me. I personally do not receive that much phishing emails. Maybe I need to somehow publish my email address a little bit more, because I think it's always a pleasure for me if phishing email reaches my inbox, because it's funny to investigate those things. This year I actually did get one, and I think that's quite an interesting one. So let's look into one example of, I would call it a multi-stage evasive phishing attempt. everything started off with a simple email here that contained basically, well, a shared document, I think, and it just embeds one link. And usually if you talk about phishing, most people's impression is that, well, if you press that link, then you actually get presented with the final logon page that's trying to steal your credentials. I can tell you that this is not true for this case and also probably not for the majority of other cases nowadays. Instead, you got opened to a link, your browser pops up, and this time it's a PDF document that's hosted on FileCloud. Well, it tells you need to download this document, and I just tried to play a real user, maybe from departments that are maybe not that technical, and I've just clicked on that to see what's going to happen. As suggested, it just goes ahead and downloads a PDF document, which again tells you, well, this is some sort of whatever summary. You basically need to open the document, well, again, so whatever is there, you just follow it, basically click that button-like looking thing there. So we're going back to the browser, and we do see, well, a Cloudflare turnstile capture. But, well, nothing super unlegitimate. I mean, you see them a lot being used, so of course we need to verify that we are human. So that's what we're going to do. We press that and we say, yes, of course, we are a human here. Well, we get another capture, so they really want to make sure that we are not a bot and the human instead. But this time it's a little bit different. Instead of having a common Cloudflare capture, it's actually something custom-made that actually tells you there's a small button on that, and to confirm you're a human, you actually need to press and hold this button for a couple of seconds. Well, let's do this again. And then we get to the first page that shows a little bit of branding information. So in this case, it's Adobe signing that tells you, hey, please, to continue, you need to enter the email of the recipient, basically, that got this initial email. While this sometimes is really the case that they just ask for the original email address, in that case, it was completely useless. You can just enter any email address to basically continue. Surprise, we do get another capture. So another time to confirm, hey, yes, third time we are actually a human and not a bot, which finally brings you to the actual phishing page. So this basically introduces a lot of issues and difficulties when it comes to automated analysis. Well, did anyone by accident actually count how many steps there have been involved where a user needs to do some actual clicking there? It's actually 7 times. So with this sort of phishing attempt, the author behind it gives any user that's going to receive that phishing attempt 7 times the opportunity to somehow detect whether this might be a phishing attempt or not. 7 times, right? And it still looks like that the trade-off that the actor behind it needs to make, that some users realize, hey, this is a bit fishy, so I'm going to stop here, is still, well, acceptable low than if they do not add this additional steps. For example, automated security tools can detect this prior, and the user doesn't even, well, this phishing email doesn't even reaches the user's inbox, basically. So this is what we do see currently happening on the phishing side. And as you can imagine, this is really causing lots of issues when it comes to automated analysis. You need to do a lot of clicking, you need to even fill forms, you need to deal with captures and even customize captures that are going to keep us very busy. So let's move on and try to sum that a little bit up. First of all, let's start with some detection opportunities that we can learn from all of those things that we have seen over the recent months. So first of all, when it comes to detection engineering itself, the indicators of behavior are way more relevant than the indicators of compromise. It's completely different business at the end. We really want to focus on what do we see and what can we use that for to basically build detection logics on that. It's also relevant to enrich the behavior we see with a little bit more of context. What that means actually is that in most cases, when it comes to sandbox analysis, sandboxes have to be a little bit more aggressive when it comes to scoring. Considering there is a script maybe that makes adjustments to the Windows firewall. From a sandbox point of view, with the initial, well, let's say, goal that you mainly want to analyze files that might be malicious, it's already highly suspicious. If you combine this maybe with adjustment to Windows Defender configuration, sandboxes in most cases will flag this as malicious. Although it could be the case that this might be a script that has been developed by an IT administrator, And then, of course, it could also be still quite legitimate. So there's a big difference why having some context around where the stuff is coming from is in often cases super relevant. Then, of course, as mentioned, combining multi-behavior together into some meta rules is relevant because one event itself might be just suspicious. You can have 2 or 3 events that still are getting flagged as suspicious itself. But if you combine them and if you chain them all together, you get the broader picture, which really can help you in identifying malicious behaviors and patterns. Well, the usage of uncommon and privileged APIs, of course, it's also super relevant. If there is some rare API usage, it definitely should raise some alarms. And when you talk about phishing, well, static and reputation analysis only is nowadays actually not really enough anymore because we have seen this massive phishing attempt with 7 different stages. Of course, it gives you a lot of detection opportunities in the beginning, but overall, just looking statically into one of these URLs is no longer enough at the end. And of course, checking the legitimacy and the context of captures is also relevant because some cases, pages are only showing captures and nothing else, which is quite uncommon basically, except for the Cloudflare turnstile capture, but it's a good indicator that something is happening there. So finally, the takeaways and what we can actually learn from that in a bigger picture here, that sandbox evasion itself is usually a super strong signal and great opportunity for us for detection engineering. So every single evasion technique that is being implemented that either interacts with Windows API or with different stuff is giving us behavioral information that we can build for creating new detections. Evasion is super common. We are actually seeing this from script kiddies up to even sophisticated threat actors. All will use them. Some of them have maybe not the best ideas. Some of them do have better ideas, but we just see them across the whole scope. And of course, whenever we see something new, we basically are somehow forced to build new detections upon that or improve our product. But at the same time, we need to consider that when we came up with new defense measures, this can also act as a driver and a motivator for the threat actors basically to also improve their tooling. Keep watching open source tools and research projects, as mentioned. There's a lot of stuff on GitHub that can really be highly relevant and important that you need to keep in your minds. And finally, from my point of view, if you really want to be safe, think running everything inside a virtual machine might help you actually, because there's plenty of evasion techniques that are trying to stop the execution of malware if they identify that they are going to be executed in a virtual machine. So I think it's, well, one of the obvious things we have learned throughout the time, then if you try to not hide your virtual machine, you actually cannot get infected in a couple of cases at least. With that being said, thanks for your time, and if there are any questions, I'm actually happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you. There was a question in one of the previous sessions about give us some tips for helping detection. You just gave a list of 6 of them, so thank you. We haven't got much time, but there definitely are some questions, so I'll do them as quickly as many as I can. How does the GPU ID evasion technique work when it comes to the likes of embedded devices and those with APUs? Do threat actors take these into account, or do they discount victims as a result?
Well, to be honest, yeah, so I mean, we basically mainly focus on actually not embedded devices, so our main focus is desktop environments and also server environments. Although, to be honest, I don't really think that these evasion techniques on embedded devices or even IoT devices is currently that big, basically. So I think from a threat actor's point of view, they are actually going to infect embedded devices, in most cases, to build botnets and similar stuff. So I don't really believe that they're actually taking a lot of care when it comes to trying to understand whether this is a analysis environment or not, and there is actually also not that many, I think, that are capable of analyzing embedded devices. I think it's more or less bigger impact on desktop and server devices versus on just embedded devices.
Right, the next question, very complex because it says maybe closely guarded knowledge. It's a question about 2 questions then, a good starting point for bypassing captures in the context of web scraping, and is AI LLMs, is that going to change all of that?
Yeah, that's actually interesting and difficult at the same time. So I do believe that AI and LLMs can indeed help in the future to make bypasses of captures more, let's say, easier and more approachable. Although, of course, vendors that come up with captures, they do indeed get also smarter. So they also try, whenever someone finds some ways to bypass them, they also try to find some ways to avoid it. Because, I mean, that's their basic point of business, right? They try to build those captures to avoid automated and bot usage, basically. But of course, when it comes to doing analysis on that, I be honest, I can't share that much on how this is basically being done. But although some of the captures, especially the turnstile captures, they are way easier to basically get around versus, you know, all of those funny and weird captures that need some image movements, building puzzles together. So of course, this is way more difficult. Although I think up until now, we haven't really seen those advanced captures being used by phishing. Nowadays, it's mainly Cloudflare stuff anyways.
And I'm guessing then, given you said you can't go into too much detail, you might not be able to say too much about this. Have you had much engagement from Cloudflare about abuse of their?
Yeah, we did try, but I think we didn't reach any good point there. I think Cloudflare is a very big company. We are sort of a smaller company, so it's a little bit more difficult basically getting into that. Although I think Cloudflare is also being put into a little bit of a difficult position there, because on one side, of course, security community wants to help protect people, so they sort of need some ways around that. But at the same time, Cloudflare claims to build bot detection tools, so essentially that's also what security tools basically do. So it's a little bit back and forth and very difficult to resolve at the end.
Really quick final question, because we want to finish on a positive note. You've given us a whole list of things that we might do. What are the quickest wins for evasion detections to implement in EDR?
Well, I'm not a big into EDRs, although I believe that depending on the quality of the EDR and of the name of the EDR, there are easier ways you get around them. I mean, if I've mentioned a couple of those techniques, like the indirect system calls, a random version of that, call-stack spoofing, and all of that stuff, that's usually quite doable as long as the EDR is going to run in user mode. Of course, if the EDR operates in kernel mode, and a lot of them are actually migrating to that if they are not there yet, basically, then it's getting way more difficult, although there's also a recent tool that got been published. I think it was called EDR Freeze, basically, which is based on a vulnerability. So there's quite a lot of tools and techniques out there that you can still use, basically, to get around EDRs. But in most cases, it's a one-time solution that works against one. And if you need another one, you basically need to go back to the research board and start from the beginning.
All right, I'm going to squeeze in a final question before the break, just on a lighter note. You're in front of nearly 500 people. Threat hunters, threat intelligence analysts, all sorts of cyber defenders. Did you seriously say in front of all of these people that you're really disappointed that you don't get very many phishing emails?
Yes, I did.
All right.
I know, maybe it's a bad idea for doing this to 500 people, but I do.
I have to point out the Computer Misuse Act at this point, but you know what to do. Patrick, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.